Something is happening right now that for decades seemed pretty much impossible. After a 50-year fight, the US federal government is officially, and I mean formally, changing its mind on cannabis. So we're going to break down what this historic shift really means, why on earth it's happening now, and, where we go from here.
And look, this isn't just some small tweak in the rules. In May of 2024, the president himself came out and called it a historic move, one that's meant to reverse a failed approach. So let's get into it. What exactly is changing, and why is this such a monumental deal?
For the first time in over half a century, the federal government is taking real official steps to change how it legally classifies cannabis. And this one move could reshape, well, pretty much everything, from medical research to the entire business landscape of the industry. Okay, so here's the headline. The Department of Justice has officially kicked off the process to move cannabis from Schedule 1 all the way down to Schedule 3. Now, if the term Schedule 1 doesn't ring a bell, don't worry, you are definitely not alone. To really get how huge this is, we first have to decode what these government schedules actually are.
This whole system comes from just one law, passed way back in 1970, and ever since then, it has defined America's entire approach to drugs.
So the Controlled Substances Act is basically the government's official ranking system for drugs. It sorts them into 5 different categories, or schedules, and it all comes down to 3 key questions. 1. How high is the potential for abuse? 2. Does it have any accepted medical use? And 3. Is it safe to use even with a doctor watching over you?
And ever since that law was passed, cannabis has been locked away in Schedule 1. This is the absolute highest, most restrictive category there is. It's reserved for what the government considers the most dangerous substances with zero redeeming value.
Okay, this is where it gets really mind-boggling. Just look at this chart. For 50 years, cannabis has been sitting right there in Schedule 1, next to heroin and LSD. The definition? High potential for abuse and, this is the key part, no accepted medical use. Now, look one row down at Schedule 2. You see cocaine, methamphetamine, Oxycontin. The government says yes, these have a high potential for abuse, but they do have accepted medical uses. So just let that sink in for a second. For over half a century, the official federal stance has been that cannabis is more dangerous and has less medical value than meth. Moving it to Schedule 3 isn't just a little shuffle, it's a complete 180 on that entire way of thinking. So you have to ask, why? Why was cannabis stuck in the most restrictive category for so long? Well, the entire debate has always come down to 3 very specific legal goalposts. For any drug to be placed in Schedule 1, it has to check all 3 of these boxes. It must have a high potential for abuse, absolutely no accepted medical use, and be considered unsafe. For decades, advocates for change have been shouting that cannabis just doesn't meet this test, while the government has dug in its heels and insisted that it does. And right here, you can see the 2 sides of that fight laid out. On one side, advocates for rescheduling had been pointing to the 38 states with medical cannabis laws and saying, hello, this is proof of accepted medical use. They also point to studies showing its side effects are pretty tolerable. But the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, has always pushed back. They have their own strict criteria, and they've argued that without massive federally approved clinical trials, there's no federally accepted medical use. They've even argued that the drug's popularity is proof of its high potential for abuse. It's been this fundamental clash of definitions that's kept everything in a deadlock for decades. And believe me, it has been a long, long fight. This recent announcement from the Department of Justice didn't just pop up out of nowhere. It is the result of years and years of relentless pressure, legal battles, and a massive shift in public opinion. This timeline really puts into perspective what a marathon this has been. The very first petition to get cannabis rescheduled was filed way back in 1972. And get this, 16 years later, in 1988, a DEA judge actually agreed. He recommended moving it to Schedule 2 and wrote that it's one of the safest, therapeutically active substances known to man. But he was overruled by his boss, the DEA administrator. And for decades, that was the story. Petitions were filed, the DEA would say no, rinse and repeat, even as recently as 2016. And that's what makes this 2024 proposal such a stunning reversal. While that federal battle was just raging on and on, the rest of the country was moving in a completely different direction. This number, 38, really shows the huge disconnect that has grown between what the states are doing and what the federal government's policy has been. For years, you've had patients and businesses in these states following state law, while technically breaking federal law every single day.
So with 38 states basically creating their own rules, what finally broke the logjam at the federal level? It was this specific kind of bureaucratic process. A petition gets filed, but the real game changer is step 3. The Department of Health and Human Services, HHS, does a deep scientific and medical review. And here's the kicker. On all those scientific and medical questions, their recommendation is binding. The DEA can't just ignore it. So after HHS reviewed decades of new evidence and real-world data from all those state medical programs, they finally concluded in 2023 that yes, cannabis does have an accepted medical use. That recommendation was the domino that finally set this whole thing in motion.
All right, so now we get to the big question. What does this actually change on the ground? And it is really important to be crystal clear here. This is a massive, massive shift, but it is not the same thing as total nationwide legalization.
At its very core, moving to Schedule 3 is a formal admission from the U.S. government that yes, cannabis has legitimate medical value, and no, it's not as dangerous as drugs like heroin or even cocaine. That alone is a historic reversal of the government's official position.
So what does this mean in the real world? Well, first, it's going to become much easier for scientists to actually research cannabis. It also paves the way for the possibility of FDA-approved medicines made from cannabis. But, and this is the big one, this does not federally legalize recreational cannabis. All of those state legal dispensaries you see, they are still technically illegal under federal law. This change doesn't fix that conflict. In fact, you could argue it makes things even more complicated. So while rescheduling finally closes the book on a 50-year-old argument about the medical value of cannabis, it throws open a whole new library of questions. How is the federal government going to regulate a substance that it now sees as a medicine when almost half the country treats it like a six-pack of beer? This isn't the end of the story, not by a long shot. It's the start of a brand new and very, very complicated chapter.